to the Bangers and Classics podcast with me, James Ruppert, and the other chap is David Milloy. And we talk all sorts of nonsense about vehicles and cars and the past and the future. And plus, we're going to plug some books as well, which we may have written. But apart from that, are you well, David?
Oh, well, thank you very much, James. And you?
Absolutely, yeah. It depends what time this comes out, but there's snow where we are, so everyone's driving very carefully. I'm very impressed by the standards of driving on display, because a lot of stuff around our way we actually don't get gritted at all. So you do have to be quite cautious.
Indeed. Well, we're very lucky here. It's cold at night, a bit of frost, but the sun's out and shining, which makes a bit of a change here. But never mind. Anyway, we had a message sent to us by a friend on Twitter, a chap called Simon Moffat, who heard that there might be a podcast in the offing and suggested that we perhaps look at some of the less revered cars, the unsung heroes. So with that in mind, how about we start off with everybody's favourite 1970s car, the Austin Allegro. What are your memories of the Allegro, James?
Well, they're not all completely great. I was around and saw them brand new. My uncle Charlie actually bought a brand new one, and that wasn't great. I mean, essentially, what an Allegro was a sort of a new version of the 1100, 1300 range. It was an update. And actually, the styling of it is these days you can slightly confuse it with an Alfa Romeo, Alfa Sud. I think very, very slightly if you half shut your eyes and look away a bit. And so, it was quite fashionable, and it was most famous for having a Cortex steering wheel, which wasn't completely round. And I don't think anybody could see the point of it at the time. And obviously, it was dropped. So, in a way, it didn't have a good start, and it was replacing a tremendously successful car. So it had an awful lot to live up to. And as with most things in the 1970s, it was very disappointing. It wasn't especially reliable, but that's mainly due to it being built by British Leyland. And it was, just compared to an 1100/1300, which was, basically a family car that everybody thought was great, and it was a rival at the time to the Cortina, although it was rather smaller. But the Allegro just couldn't match it for overall reliability, just being nice to drive. I mean, there are technical issues with it. It had hydrogas suspension, which again wasn't a fabulous thing to have, because eventually some of the gas goes out of one side, and it becomes expensive to fix. But it just wasn't a consistently good car, and that's all people wanted in the 1970s, was a car that started in the morning and got them to work and back. And that's why everybody went and bought Japanese cars. So I think we can blame the Allegro for everybody buying Japanese cars. That's my view, anyway.
Maybe a bit harsh there, James. One of the things that was said about the Allegro was that it was more aerodynamic going in reverse than forwards. But the reality is that most cars are like that.
Absolutely. No, that's perfectly correct. I think, but wasn't the worst thing is that if you did jack it up on one side, the window could pop out.
The rear screen could, yes.
That's right. So unstructurally unsound that could happen, and you get some ventilation where you didn't want it.
Well, talking of unsoundness in Allegros, a relative of mine, I won't name him to protect the stupid, but he had a black Allegro back in about 83, and at that time we were teenagers. And he managed to get rid of his in an interesting fashion. The first stroke against it came when he tried to spray some water onto some abusive young ladies who were taking the mickey out of his car. He drove forward through a puddle. They jumped, missed the spray. He thought, aha, I'll get them, put it in reverse, reversed back through the puddle, missed him again, but didn't hit the brakes hard enough, and somehow contrived to ram the back of his Allegro into the tyre of an earth mover. They'd been sitting there for, all the while we'd been in the car park. He just completely not noticed it. So the end result was that his boot looked like Cyril Smith had been using it as a trampoline. So not the best. However, it still ran after that. And he finished the job in wrecking the car by yumping it over humpback bridges near his house. Now, he thought this was a great idea and great fun. Unfortunately, the Allegro chassis didn't, and that was the end of it. At least it didn't die of rust, which leads us to another topic about 1970s cars and rust. Italian cars acquired a terrible reputation for rust in the 1970s, but James, I think it's fair to say that they weren't the only culprits, were they?
I think just about all cars were rusty. Cars had a finite life. They ran out of road after about a decade, mostly. It's very rare for them to sort of go beyond that, especially if they were looked after. The alternative was they were parked in a barn and they were found last week and triumphed as a barn find. Which is a phrase that we can explore in the future, I think. But yeah, keeping to rust. Yeah, it was as bad as people say. We put a lot of salt on the road. That's part of the problem. They weren't built great. I remember actually going to look at Minis being made, and that was in the 90s, and they still had the same problem that actually if you took the boot off, they didn't prepare the paint area around them at all, and 90s Minis rusted just as virulently as the 60s Minis because they were just as badly built, really, or just as built without a care in the world, really. So it was. I mean, there was a lot of talk about substandard metal, and I don't think that was really the case. It was just that they were substandardly put together. And I may have mentioned this before, but if people scan their eyes, if they go to the wonderful Bangers and Classics website, there is a vehicle right at the top of the page, which is a Polski Fiat. So that actually is Italian, but via being built in Poland. It's actually a Fiat 124, which was a magnificent vehicle. The Polski Fiat version was less magnificent because it was a bit sort of heavier to drive and not so sweet. But if listeners to us become readers and look at the top of the page, they will see the Polski Fiat that I used to own at the end of the 1980s, and the indicators are held on by band-aids. So they're actually plasters are holding it on. There wasn't enough metal left to screw the actual indicator into, and the owner cared so much about their vehicle that instead of rebuilding it or buying a new wing, just got two plasters out of the packet in his bathroom, and there you can clearly see them holding the indicator on. So yeah, the 70s were really bad for rust. Things got better in the 80s. If anybody owned a VW Golf around that time, you actually would have found wax. It usually came out of the rear tailgate. There would actually be streaks of wax, and that gave you some idea. They did rust eventually, but they did pump them full of the stuff. So instead of them falling apart after 10 years, they fell apart after about 15. So that was some sort of progress. But certainly cars, as we came into the 90s and the 2000s, rust is quite a rare thing. And there's only outbreaks. Again, it's when quality control goes on the back burner, and probably the most notable car company that thought, oh, I know where we can save a few bob, or in those days a few marks, was Mercedes-Benz, who cut right back on their quality, and you found that the C-Class, the E-Class, and even the S-Class would start to rust. And it's funny looking around a car park when you can see right the way through, the wings, the front and rear wings, and the sills on those, which are, to me, relatively modern cars. I won't
Indeed.
go on.
Well, indeed, yes. But I mean, you were saying about elastic bands. I suppose it makes a change from newspapers, chicken wires, and filler, which found their way into a lot of cars back in the 70s and indeed in the 80s as a bod.
That's right. Of course, yes.
I mean, and that's just the areas that you can see. Some of the sill areas, etc., were repaired with effectively with papier-mâché, and put with filler across the top, whatever they could, hardened it, put some paint on it, and frankly, there were some real death traps about in those days. But that was an era where you had unscrupulous car retailers or salesmen who used to put sawdust in the gearbox to mask the fact that the transmission was on its last legs. You wouldn't really find that so much nowadays, or would you?
I don't know whether you do. What you seem to find these days is that people don't prepare cars very, very well. That's the biggest feedback I get from people who have many dealings with them. And if you just go and have a look for yourself, just go and kick a few tires, I think you will look at some vehicles and think, really, it's come straight from an auction. And they've not done anything to it. There's an argument for that in that, why spend money on it until you've actually sold it? But actually, a lot of car dealers are very, very lazy, I find. So they will just stick them on the forecourt, do the minimum amount, and hope it gets sold and that you forget where you bought it from, I think, eventually. But it is, I think, the preparation, and also what they take for granted is that the cars are much better built than they used to be. There was a lot of preparation, that used to have to go into a car before it could be put onto a forecourt. Whereas now, it'll probably be fine if you just stick it there and nobody will notice. And your argument with people is, well, it's a used car, so why should I, fix this, fix that, replace that? And my experience of buying cars in the last few years from dealers is that you have to say, no, I'm not buying it until you replace that or you find that part, because I'm not going to go to the bother of going on eBay unless you make it very much cheaper. So I don't think there are dodgy dealers. I do know people who sell cars for a living and they are very good. And the point of business is you want people to come back and buy cars from you. There really isn't any point in cheesing off one person because they just tell their friends. But there are some dealers who are just lazy, and it's just what you've got to do is just avoid them and try and find the people who want to please you, really. Oddly enough, there's a dealer local to us who we've bought a couple of cars from for our daughter over the years, and they couldn't have been better. In many ways, it looks like a typical cheesy used car dealer lot, but they couldn't be more helpful. They would just give you the keys. They won't come on a test drive with you. They'll say, you go and enjoy yourself, and they don't put any pressure on you. And in many ways, that's the best sort of way to be sold a car. You can make your mind up and look into it, and you might get a better car. So there are positive ways of buying a banger, and maybe even a classic.
Well, absolutely, yes. The other thing you've got to watch out for is servicing, of course. Cars are properly serviced. There was one chap who will have to remain nameless. I didn't actually act for this guy when I was a lawyer, but I knew of him. And one of his stunts was to tell people that he changed the oil in a car, and all he did was actually clean the oil filter. Just take a cloth to it, give it a good clean, make it look like new, and say, there you go, there's a new oil filter in there. Oil filter had not been changed, nor the oil. And in my own experience, I've written about this. There was one firm I used to work for. I had a company car, had various problems with it, took it to the firm's ace mechanic, who will again remain nameless. And he said, this was a Friday. I went to pick it up on the Friday. He says, needs a new speedo cable, come back in on Monday. Great. Okay, drove the car home and pulled out to pass another car. This was a Rover 213 automatic. Loads of space in front of me. Put the foot down to knock it into kick down, and nothing happened. It was a case of getting a couple of whiskies down me to be able to steady my hand to reach the bottle for the tranquilizers when I get in the door. After that experience, went back to the guy on the Monday, said to him, what the heck have you done to the car? The kick down doesn't work. Oh, did we not tell you? We removed the kick down cable. I could have been killed. Maybe that was the intention. Maybe that's what my bosses were after. He's too late. Get rid of him. But yeah, so you've got to watch out for these. I mean, this is back, of course, in the 90s again. And standards are, as you say, James, definitely higher today. But there's still the odd, shall we say, character about it pays people to watch out and take care. Go on word of mouth. Obviously, the basis of your own experience, but don't take anyone's word for it. Check it out insofar as you can, just to make sure that if someone says something's been done, that it in fact has been done. Because ultimately, it's your car, it's your pocket, and indeed in some cases, as with the kickdown cable, it could be your neck on the line if you don't. Anyway, go back to this 1970s, and there's one last thing from the 1970s I want to talk about very, very quickly, and that is car chases. But first of all, here's a word from our sponsors. Check out the Bangers and Classics website at www.bangersandclassics.com, where you'll find links to some of the books that James and I have written, as well as some other interesting content. So, James, was the 1970s the best era for cinematic car chases?
I think it was, because they were real. There were actually people driving the cars, and what you saw them do is what actually happened. There was no CGI, which may do for you and for me. It just spoils modern films. You can see, all the bits happening. You can see the gaffer tape holding it all together. And as much as I quite enjoy the nonsense of the Fast and Furious films, but really, nothing makes very much sense with those, because you've got flying cars and stuff, and the cars didn't fly. They were in a studio, but there was a green screen. Whereas the old stuff, they actually had to do it, and it was probably extremely dangerous.
Yeah, well, they had a flying car in the James Bond film, The Man with the Golden Gun.
Yeah.
But of course, it didn't actually fly. What you see taking off is a model. But earlier in the film, you've got the stunt where James Bond, driving an AMC, does a barrel roll when crossing a broken bridge over a river. And that was done for real. It wasn't the first time it was performed in the movie, though. The movie was probably the second time. It was a stunt called the Astro Spiral. And I think it was called the Astro Spiral because the first time it was performed was 2 years before the Bond movie came out at Houston Astrodome. But it was a real stunt. There's no CGI involved. There's no models involved. It's a real car, suitably modified, with a stunt driver doing it. And it's the perfect stunt, really. And they did it in one take, which is, when you think about it, was quite incredible to do something of that complexity. But, they pulled it off. And the car, I believe, still exists to this day. But obviously that James Bond film wasn't really about car chases. In the 70s, you had films like Vanishing Point, which was really one long road trip come car chase from start to finish. You had The French Connection and its iconic car chase, which they didn't have permission for from the local authority, though the police helped out in some of the scenes. But I'm told there is a scene where a car, you can see it in the film, a car got onto the set, was hit, and shouldn't have been there. It was a local who was possibly driving to work, going about his business, and managed to get onto a live film set and was struck by one of the film cars. Fortunately, he wasn't injured, and the film company made good the damage to his car. But I think the best of the 70s films for car chases is one that's kind of an unheralded film, but it's linked in many ways to the French Connection. It's called The 7-Ups. Are you familiar with that one, James?
I'm not, no.
Okay, in the French Connection, you've got obviously two main characters. You've got Popeye Doyle, who's the excellent Gene Hackman, and his sidekick, who's played by Roy Scheider. Now, the character in the 7-Ups is based on the same character that Scheider played in the French Connection, and indeed, again, Scheider plays it. The people who did the stunts in the French Connection, the stunt coordinator, Bill Hickman, also did the stunt coordination for the 7-Ups, and the producer of the French Connection produced and directed the 7-Ups. So there's obviously a very close connection between the two films, which actually goes back to Bullet, because you've got, again, people involved in that, including the producer of Bullet, who, again, was director of the 7-Ups. You've got the stunt driver, Bill Hickman, who appeared in all three films and did some of the stunts in all three films. So you've got a really strong connection. I won't spoil the details, but if you should watch the 7-Ups car chase. It's a combination, I suppose, of the greatest hits and misses of Bullet and the French Connection. There's no chasing of trains. I can assure you won't be disappointed. And again, no CGI. It's all done for real.
Fantastic. And actually, whilst you were talking about those films, another film popped into my mind. I don't know whether this is strictly car chase, but it's a film called Two Lane Blacktop. And that, I thought, there was a whole spate of films. It was a bit like Vanishing Point, which in a way is a completely pointless film. And Two Lane Blacktop was a completely pointless film, and it was a bit hippy dippy as well. But it had a lot to do with car culture as well. In that you just thought, well, what you mainly thought is, I'd love to be in California, Nevada, or wherever, driving, down endless roads, because it just looked the most fabulous lifestyle. That all you needed, was a hot rod or a muscle car, and you could have an immense amount of fun. There were obviously recreational drugs involved and all sorts of terrible things like that. But I did find them sort of, I suppose they are sort of hypnotically interesting films, in that actually, most of the script is rubbish, but as you say, the cars are fun to watch, and certainly in Vanishing Point, it's it's a good laugh, and there's a extremely cool Charger, which is being delivered, and you just think, well, whoever's going to receive that is going to be very disappointed. At the other end, when he gets to the showroom, they're going to say this is going to cost $10,000 to sort out. But then again, as we all know, it doesn't quite make it. I don't know if I spoiled it for anybody there. But absolutely, they are quite fascinating films. I'm going to have to sort out that film that you mentioned, the Seven Ups. But I would also, you can't say to people enough times go and watch Vanishing Point. But Two Lane Blacktop is good. It's got the great Warren Oates in it, an older actor, and it's also got James Taylor's in it as well.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, they remade Vanishing Point, I think, as a TV movie, possibly in the 90s, with Viggo Mortensen in the lead role. He was possibly best known for his role as Aragorn in the Lord of the Rings films.
Yeah.
But it's not a patch to the original. And it's in the same way that the 2003 version of The Italian Job is acceptable enough on its own, but it's no way compares to the original. And it's a bit of a problem with these sort of films. If you make something that's as good and iconic as those films, don't try to make a sequel to them. Move on, make something original. I think anyway.
Right. Oh no, I think you're absolutely correct, and I think we can add to that Death Race 2000, I think, which they also did, and that was pretty awful.
David Carradine, yeah.
But I mean, really, as you say, with most things, and that applies to most films, is that they should come up with original concepts, and obviously, David, that is something that we could supply to them, couldn't we? I mean, we are chock full of ideas for Hollywood films and TV series. So people shouldn't remake old rubbish. It's a bit like the remake of Get Carter, which is almost unwatchable. But
I've not seen it for that reason. It's
that's right.
I thought this was going to be bad. I quite like Stallone in some films.
I do. Yeah, absolutely.
But no. Leave Get Carter alone. It's of its time. It's of a piece. Leave it alone. And find something original. You can maybe find something that taps into the spirit of it or the vibe, which is fine. But just don't call it Get Carter. Don't call it The Italian Job, because you can never replicate them. Lightning doesn't strike twice when it comes to movies. As a rule, very, very seldom will you find a remake or a sequel that's anything like as good as the original. Whether it involves cars or not is irrelevant. It's just, you can't do that.
No, well, that's right. Well, I mean, the problem they are going to have with future car chases is obviously once the batteries run down. The first bit will be quite exciting, and then the second bit won't be, as they try and find somewhere to plug their cars in. And obviously, the noise, there won't be any noise, and that's half the fun, isn't it? But I'm sure they can dub that in. But there you go.
Well, I mean, we could begin back to the days of a chap walking in front of the car with a red flag. Have that in films, it would be quite funny.
Yeah.
I don't know. Electric cars, that's another whole topic to discuss, and I'm sure we will at some point. In fact, I know we will at some point. Anyway, so basically what we're saying is, if you want to look at a good car chase, go to the 70s, to some extent also the 80s. Really, the pre-CGI era is where the action's at. It's where all the good stuff's at. Go and look at it. You won't find the sort of protracted character arcs and nonsense like that in these kind of films. The films that are much more simple, much more streamlined, and to my mind, they're all the better for it. So in the spirit of the 70s, all it remains to say is goodbye from me.
And it's a goodbye from him.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.